Good evening. I'm Bob Shrum, the director of the Unruh Institute of Politics. I have a few announcements. The first is that one of the reasons that we have fewer men than women here, I think, is the Yankees-Minnesota playoff game, and it's 3-3 in the second inning. Second, we'll kick off our new series called The Great Divides next Tuesday in partnership with Community Advocates, a nonprofit organization advocating innovative approaches to human and race relations in LA. And the LA Times' Christine Bellantoni will moderate a discussion next week on geography, the coasts versus middle America. If you're a student here interested in empowering the next generation of women leaders, please talk to Rachel Ubade in the back of the room about volunteering for our Young Women's Leadership Conference on Saturday, October 21st at the Radisson. We're about halfway through our weekly programs, and I want to pay tribute to ProCon because this has been a productive, enlightening, and engaging relationship, and we thank you very much. For those who are here, you could take some time to fill out a quick survey. I guess you get it somewhere in the back when we're done. I also want to welcome Miguel Contreras, who's the producer of There Goes the Neighborhood Los Angeles, a podcast series on KCRW examining the winners and losers of neighborhood gentrification and the forces driving it in LA. You can download the episodes, and you already knew this, on iTunes. Let's go ahead with our panel: gentrification, densification, and why the rent is so damn high. To my immediate right, Richard Close, president of the Sherman Oaks Homeowners Association, chairman of the Oversight Board for the Dissolution of the City of Los Angeles Redevelopment Agency, member of the Local Agency Formation Commission for the San Fernando Valley. Christine Rangel, Director of Government Affairs at the Los Angeles Ventura chapter of the Building Industry Association of Southern California, previously Government Affairs and Special Projects Executive for the National Electrical Contractors Association, New York City chapter. She's also an Unruh ambassador. John P. Wilson, Professor of Spatial Sciences and Sociology at Dornsife, where he founded and directs the landmark Spatial Sciences Institute. He is also part of the School of Architecture and the Viterbi School of Engineering. Sudha M. Reddy is the Managing Principal and Chief Executive Officer of Haven Realty Capital. He oversees all aspects of the finance and acquisitions platforms. He holds an MBA from the Marshall School of Business and a Master's in Real Estate Development from Price. So let's welcome the panel, and I'm going to start off with a question that everybody can take a crack at if you want. And we'll start, Richard, you can go first. How big a problem do you think housing affordability is, and what solutions would you favor?
Well, it's a tremendous problem, but it's a very simple problem. Not enough supply and too much demand. So obviously the solution is very complicated. I think we're going to hear tonight, and we've heard in the media, many simple solutions for a complex problem. And I think we have to recognize the fact that everyone wants to live next to their jobs, everyone wants to live in beautiful neighborhoods, and there just isn't enough of those homes or apartments in the area in order to satisfy everyone's needs.
Well, I will second that by saying that it absolutely is a problem. I think that anyone who lives in an off-campus house and has to pay market rate rent probably knows that it's a very expensive city to live in. But echoing what was just said, it's certainly a problem of supply and demand. I'm sure I'll get into this later at some point in the game, but California has historically been underproducing the amount of housing that they need to for decades. And that is due to a variety of reasons, but the consequences then mean that you simply don't have enough for everyone to go around. And then those consequences, when you don't have enough, means that the people with the financial wherewithal who can secure a unit of housing, they get the first pick. And that means that the very poorest people either get pushed out onto the streets, which of course we're seeing with 50,000 people in the city of LA who are homeless right now. And if they don't get pushed out onto the street, sometimes they get pushed out of the state. And we are also seeing the numbers increase of those people who are being pushed out of the state. And the solution, I would say in a nutshell, is just to build more. Now that's complicated, but Tokyo just did it. Tokyo also has an affordability crisis, and they said, you know what, we're just going to build.
John?
Do I have to turn this on, or it's ready to go? I think it might be ready to go. So I don't disagree with either of the first two speakers, but I think it's not just about building, but it's probably about how you build, because if you want to put people together so that their housing is close to their jobs, then we probably have to think of creative ways to build attractive, affordable housing that's at a much denser scale than in many parts of the city that we see today. So the solution can't be to continue growing single-family homes and subdivisions out beyond the 15 and out beyond Rancho Cucamonga and having people work on the west side. That may be in a narrow sense satisfactory, but that's no quality of life for somebody if they're going to commute 2 or 3 hours each way every day.
Sudha?
Well, certainly agree with everyone on the panel. I come more from the investment side here, so I suppose, I've seen affordability be a major issue, not only on the rental housing side, but also on the for sale side. This last recession created a very difficult environment for individuals to buy houses. And as a result, you've seen a lot of individuals push to the rental housing market, and there certainly just isn't enough supply of either rental housing or for sale housing. So certainly, I think we need more. I think it's way above my pay grade to figure out exactly how that happens. But as an investor, I've been investing in other markets, in other states, and we certainly see the migration out of Southern California, Northern California, California in general, and into other states. And unfortunately, for most people who are struggling to be here, I see leaving the state as a very viable and reasonable thing to do, because other states have jobs, are pro-business, and do not have the affordability crisis that we have here.
Okay, I want to pick up on a couple of things that were said. First, I'm sufficiently old that I can remember when I was a kid growing up here, that in the morning, all of the traffic, even before the freeways, but all of the traffic was trying to go downtown from the west side. And in the evening, all of the traffic was trying to go back. Today, when I come to USC, if I leave after 9 o'clock in the morning or so, it's a breeze to get here from the west side down the 10. And all the jobs have moved over, or not all the jobs, many jobs have been created on that side of town. It used to be a place where people just mostly lived, except for the studios and the aircraft factories. Now you have an immense number of jobs, but a lot of the people working in those jobs can't afford to live there. Do you think there's any governmental action or regulation that can somehow or other break through this and get more of this housing? John, you were mentioning where people live, where they need to live where they work. Build on the west side. And how are you going to break through all the neighborhood opposition?
Well, first of all, I think the problem is somewhat on the stage here. What I mean is, you get the unions who rightfully want the highest wages possible. You have the investors who want to make the highest profit possible. No one wants to build below moderate income housing apartments. They all want to build $5,000, $6,000 a month apartments. Regulations that you brought up cause the problem, don't solve the problem. Rent control came into Los Angeles City in 1978. As a result of rent control, a certain number of people have a huge benefit. They're paying $1,100 rents in apartments that would normally go for $3,000 a month. But a lot of people will not build because their housing in that area is dilapidated, because there's not money to invest in keeping up the buildings. So regulations are not the answer. The answer is to get financing, federal, state, local. I co-signed HHH on the ballot to provide bonding for low-income housing. That's the solution. Government regulations make the problem worse.
Anyone else want to take a crack at that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would actually like to add to that. Yes, what we need to be doing is looking at housing as a societal issue instead of looking at it the way that we do today, which is, I think there's this. I haven't really put a name on it, but I'll call it a they complex, which is, people drive by a place and they'll say, oh, look, they are putting up a movie theater where, my favorite, Bed Bath & Beyond used to be or something. They're tearing down this to put in that. We should always ask ourselves, who's they? Because they have families to feed, they have jobs to do. There's a reason that they got into the business of doing what they're doing. To provide housing or to produce housing at a level that is affordable for a family of four making $50,000 a year when your land values are so high. You just can't make that project work. So the reason that I say we need to start thinking about this as a societal problem is because it is all of our problem. The fact that we have poverty, the fact that we don't have adequate education, or that people go hungry at night, these are societal issues, and housing needs to be in there with them. That being said, the way that we solve all of those issues is we all contribute with our tax dollars, with state, federal, and local funding to contribute to fixing that issue. We don't ask a grocery store owner or a farmer to feed the people who are starving every night. That is our government's job. That's why we have a government. So we need to just start thinking about it in such a way.
John or Sudha, anything to add on this?
Well, I think the only caveat to add is that, while maybe many people pay taxes, it adds up to a certain amount of resources, and then it has to then legislatures at these different levels have to decide how to allocate those resources. And, it could well be at the end of the day that those pots of money are not large enough to accomplish the kinds of goals that people have been talking about. And so it may be part of the solution, but it's probably, given the current climate, not the whole solution.
I don't have anything to add.
Great, because I want to follow up directly on that. Governor Brown just signed 15 housing bills, one of which provides for a ballot measure for $4 billion to build affordable housing. We'll vote on it next November. But we need 100,000 extra new units a year beyond what we're building just to keep up with population. And whatever the outmigration is, there's still this incredible demand for new housing. The bond, if it passes, will provide just 14,000 affordable houses a year and be exhausted in 5 years. In other words, it won't even make up 1 year of the shortfall. And John, I think this is what you were alluding to. Do we just lack the resources to meet this challenge?
I think to some extent it's a question of resources, but to copy what others have said, to some extent it's probably in some ways a lack of vision, right? So what does it take to build a sustainable city? And in all likelihood, what we've been doing and what we're currently doing is not making very much progress towards that goal. Now, how we build a set of institutional structures to support building mixed use, kind of multi-level, not level vertically, but multi-level in the sense that you build housing that's accessible and valued by lawyers and doctors and people that are perhaps in the upper income brackets, and at the same time build other kinds of housing that would suit people at different levels of income? That's not really a question that we've asked ourselves, and in particular, we've not tried to think of any kind of homegrown solutions that could deal with that, where you bring multiple people to the table: investors, government, labour unions, all the groups that might potentially have a stake.
Anyone else? Go
Well,
ahead.
for an investor, from my perspective, it's very difficult. I mean, it's a very daunting challenge to think that someone here in, call it California, is going to really get projects through efficiently, right? I mean, it's very difficult to get anything built. Certainly, projects are getting built, but it's certainly not easy. And so part of the problem is, how do you make the process more efficient? And therein lies the issues, because I think there's plenty of capital that wants to be here in Southern California, Northern California, but the costs are astronomical. It's very hard to estimate timelines and costs of your development even before you get started. And so that's, I think, another main issue that has to be considered.
Richard, do you think we ought to limit or reduce the limits on development?
I think, first I want to address one of the unstated premise here. I'm here for one reason. I'm president of the Sherman Oaks Homeowners Association, and I take a view that's probably different than anyone to my right. And my philosophy and the philosophy of our community and communities all over LA is we need to protect our existing communities. I understand that you'd like to build 10-story apartment buildings in an area that has 1- and 2-story homes or apartments. The problem is the traffic already is unbearable. There's no parking. There's no rapid transit. So we're going to have government regulations to protect the existing housing stock. I think the answer is jobs with housing. There's nothing wrong in living in Thousand Oaks, as long as the jobs are out there, that the people don't have to commute an hour and a half in each direction. So, in my mind at least, protecting the community, whether it's Venice, Sherman Oaks, Chatsworth, San Pedro, you got to protect the existing neighborhoods first.
Go ahead.
Can I add to that?
Yeah. I was going to ask you to, actually.
Yes. So the BIA actually, we agree that neighborhoods do need to be protected, and that's something that we hear everywhere. Everyone is worried that they could be, in a single-family home, and then suddenly an apartment complex pops up next to them. Well, I want to give everyone here a little bit of background so that you understand why that's happening. The reason that is happening is because in urban planning, in every city across the United States, you have urban planners who are paid to say, okay, this is how we want Los Angeles to look like. And in those plans, you have a roadmap that is dedicated, that doesn't say you can just build whatever you want, wherever you want. I mean, you can't build, a high-rise next to a marsh, obviously. It all has to make sense, and it has to go through a public process. So that's what a general plan is for. It looks at things like, where are your parks going to go? Where is your housing going to go? And your commercial space and your transportation. It looks at everything so that we can have this nice, harmonious place to live. So it will probably surprise you when I tell you that general plans are supposed to be updated fairly regularly. And ours has not been updated since World War II. So what that means is you've got a general plan that says you've got this many people living here, so it's planned for the 1940s. And we are obviously not at population, transportation needs. We look nothing like the 1940s. I think we can all agree. So that's...
I do.
So that's kind of the tip of the iceberg of how this all got so convoluted. You also have 35 community plans within the general plan. So you'll have, let's say, the North Valley and the South Valley and parts of the West Side. They have their own community plans where their residents say, well, this is what we want our community to look like. And, that's a public process. And I encourage everyone to get involved in that public process. But those plans are also extremely out of date. So right now, the city is playing catch up. I won't go into all the details because it would take too long, but we recently had a Measure S that was on the ballot. And what came out of Measure S was, rightfully so, this idea that we can't go on living with these outdated community plans. We need something that tells us where things are going to go. But traditionally, zoning takes care of things like you have a single family home, you're not going to have, a 10-story building next to you. That doesn't make sense. So we all sit down together in a perfect world and we say, let's preserve these single family homes over here. Let's put our commercial corridor over here. It's supposed to be a process so that we don't have those issues and we don't get into the issues where we are today where builders can't build without getting a general plan amendment because the general plan amendment looks like the 1940s.
Are we really that stuck? I mean, because what you're really outlining is we have plans that are completely outdated. We have neighborhood groups that are going to be entirely resistant in many cases to building more in neighborhoods that already seem crowded or to going higher. That would suggest to me that we're stuck.
No, we're not stuck. Because the secret is, if you take away one thing tonight, the secret is that if you're a developer and you're friendly with a council member and you give some campaign money to the council member, you can get an exemption. The current rules may be 2 stories, but if you know the right guy, right, Bob? Anyways, if you know the right elected official, it can be changed to 10 because they'll all say, you're right. These plans are outdated. So therefore, I should be able to build a 10-story building. So that's the dirty secret. A lot of developers want the old plan so they can get their elected official, the council member, to give them an exemption to take property that's worth $50 a square foot and turn it into property worth $100 a square foot. This is a devious system in Los Angeles.
Sudha, is that your experience? Correspond to anything you've experienced here?
No comment. No. No, I mean, it's certainly not from our perspective, but we know it happens. I mean, you hear about it, but it's just part of the system to some extent. I think those who do it, I'm sure some do it above board and some do it below board, but I'm sure it happens. Just not in my experience.
John?
Well, I think if you go to different parts of the city, there's a different rationale that's applied to whether new development occurs or not, or what happens in the existing housing stock, and so there are a lot of things that contribute to this sort of gridlock. So one culprit is potentially something like Prop 13 because I've once owned a house in between 2 houses, and on my property I think my property taxes were 1% of whatever I purchased the house for. So let's say that was $5,000. My neighbours who bought in that subdivision when the houses were first built, theirs were less than $1,000, but they were 70. He was increasingly immobile, but they had a 2-story house. But given the circumstances, they couldn't afford to move unless they move out of state. Since their children lived in California, they weren't prepared to do that. But on the other side, where somebody bought long after I did, their house was $1 million, and so their property taxes were twice as much. If we switch from that circumstance to, say, South Pasadena, I live in Altadena. I've met surprising number of people lately who own a house somewhere else in the city, often just Pasadena, and they support a vibrant rental market in South Pasadena because they want to live there while their kids are in high school. And so they're buying the school district.
Yeah, one way to deal with people being marooned in their houses as they got older was Proposition 60.
Yes.
Which basically said that if you were over 55, you sold your house and you moved to a house of lesser value, you could keep your old property taxes. Which would mean you would pay substantially less property tax. I don't know how well it works, but it's out there, and I don't know what incentive it provides people.
Right.
I have another question that I suspect everybody's going to disagree with at least some part of. The New York Times, functioning as urban planners, recently wrote that the only way out for Los Angeles in terms of creating not only affordable housing, but needed housing, was for this city to become a vertical city with a proliferation of high-rise buildings. Now, one possibility is if you do that, the housing won't be truly affordable because the incentive for the developers is to create higher-priced apartments. One way New York has responded to that is to condition some of the permits for new high-rises on the inclusion of a certain percentage of affordable units. Does that make sense for LA? And is there any place in Sherman Oaks where you could imagine an apartment building? 10-story apartment building, 15-story apartment building?
Yes, absolutely. Right next to the 405 freeway. No, I mean, our community is primarily single-family homes and apartment buildings of up to 2 stories. So, no, but I think another part of this whole equation is certain areas of the city want the 10-story buildings. They want to be redeveloped. That's where the capital and the incentives should be. Allow the developers to go in there, give them incentives, give them greater density, because the people want that area. If this is what
Give
they
me an
want.
example.
The Northeast Valley. The councilwoman there, Nori Martinez, wants to see redevelopment. The problem is that developers want to go, hypothetically, into Sherman Oaks, Westwood, Brentwood. They don't want to go to the Northeast Valley. But if we give enough incentives, they will, and it'll revitalize these areas.
What about this New York solution? Say you can build a big apartment building. It can have a lot of market-priced housing, but it has to have a certain percentage of affordable housing.
I think it makes a lot of sense as long as it's easy to execute that.
In New York, it's been relatively easy, although
Right.
there's been controversy because what's happened is that the developers have often created 2 lobbies. One lobby for the people who paid for the full-price apartments and another lobby for the people who have the affordable apartments, so that the people who paid for the high-priced apartments don't have to mingle with the people
Which
who...
is the societal thing that Christine mentioned. I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to.
Can you see LA becoming, John, a vertical city?
Well, I think you see it downtown.
Right.
You know, the building that now has USC as its label rather than AT&T. 20 years ago when I moved here, that stood there all by itself, and within a couple of years we might not be able to see the top of it because whoever bought all the parking lots and has now turned it into condominiums threatens to cover it up. So I think there are places where development's occurring, but not in that New York style because we haven't been able to strike that kind of compromise.
Yeah. Christina, where in LA do you see the opportunity for development? I mean, we talked about the resource problem and what the state might or might not do, but you got to have the land.
Right.
And what's been suggested here is, well, there are places like the Northeast Valley, places like that where this building should go on.
Well, you have to put density where density belongs. Think about it as a, putting. I mean, liquid's not a good example. Think about like putting M&Ms into a jar. The M&Ms have to go somewhere. So where are they going to go? We can build vertically. We certainly can. But we should also be looking at, identifying pockets of the city where that density belongs. So of course, you're not going to put density in Sherman Oaks, but something that you can do, I'm not not necessarily with Sherman Oaks, but along other kind of light transit corridors, which means, if you look at a radius, you're talking about maybe a mile out from a major metro station, or 2 miles out from boulevards, et cetera. Washington, D.C. did something that I thought was brilliant. They looked at all of their, they have 1- and 2-story townhouses, essentially. And when they started having a supply-demand issue, they looked at all of those buildings and said, okay, well, let's just make them a little bit taller. Now, that worked for Washington because you can't see high-rises in Washington, D.C., right? So they did that, and that's what worked for Washington. So what works for LA, I think, is going to be a mix of that. We already do have high-rises going in downtown. One of the things that we can do that would make sense is, again, getting back to incentives. If you incentivize someone to produce a number of housing units that are below the market rate, so that's for your low or very low income individuals and families, just sweeten the deal and the developers will come. So what does that mean? You sweeten the deal by saying, okay, normally it's going to take you 3 years or 5 years to get through all of these administrative processes, which, if I were to tell you, are insane. I mean, we have so many, whether it's environmental processes or other processes that we have to go through. Time is money. So if you shorten the timeline and you go to a developer and say, okay, if you build, I'm just going to pull a number out of the air. If you build 20% affordable, so below the market rate, so if you were to sell those units by themselves, hypothetically, you would be losing money. We're asking you to build those. What if we offered you, instead of taking 5 years to get your development up in the sky and completed and get people moved in, it's going to take you 1 year. The developer's going to jump at that because, again, time is money. The clock starts ticking as soon as you ask for that several million or $7 billion liability, and as soon as you take out that loan from the bank, the clock is ticking. You've got to start moving. So the longer the clock ticks and you don't have people living in that building, the more you're just hemorrhaging money, essentially. So again, just sweeten the deal and the developers will come.
And that's in the places, not Sherman Oaks. Although it's interesting to me, by the way, that if you look at Westwood and Holmby Hills, which is some of the most expensive real estate in all of Los Angeles, it is bordered by the Wilshire Corridor, which has all of these very tall apartment buildings. And I don't see people desperately trying to get out of Holmby Hills. I wonder if there is a lack of equity in saying that even in Sherman Oaks, there aren't some places where you could actually build with higher density.
I think before we identify communities, whether it be Sherman Oaks or any other, I think you have to identify what attributes should be there. Does community X have rapid transit? Do they have wide streets like Wilshire Boulevard that can take the traffic? Are there alternative methods of people from other areas, for instance, north of Wilshire Boulevard, to get around? So I think definitely there are a lot of areas that can take more density. The trick is to find those areas, incentivize the developers, and it may take money, it may take density. But one of my problems with some of this legislation that was passed and signed by the governor is their preemption legislation. Developers did not like the fact that cities were protecting neighborhoods. So the easy solution is to change the law at the state level, which preempts all the local rules. So development is good, smart development is needed, and you need to protect the current communities.
So why do we think the preemption passed? I think the argument would come from its proponents that talking about protecting the local communities is another way of saying not in my backyard, and that there was just tremendous resistance in community after community after community to building additional housing.
And what is wrong with neighborhoods, whether they be Venice or Sherman Oaks? What is wrong with them trying to protect their neighborhood?
Well, I'm not going to answer that. I'll let somebody else do that.
Well, I think a different way of thinking about the problem is that we need a grand bargain, and that to have any grand bargain in life, you have to have everybody participate. And so we have this big shortage of housing, and so what can everybody do to contribute? And so when some communities say it's our privilege to opt out, then that reduces the room for negotiation. And so maybe the Governor Brown says, well, okay, let's create a set of circumstances where we want everybody in.
Where communities feel pressure to be in.
And then maybe different communities can be in different ways that they can help self-identify, but everybody has to give up something, right? And then we might make some progress.
Before I get to the politics of all this, which I want to talk, which we have been, but I want to be more direct about it. So we've talked about places where we can build. When I drive around Los Angeles, actually I don't drive, but when I am being driven around Los Angeles, most often by my wife, I don't see a lot of vacant land. So when we develop this land and we build it, where do the people who live there go? And where should they go? I mean, do we just keep pushing people out to, far east Los Angeles, then into Riverside County, and you have people with 2.5-hour commutes to get to work? How do we deal with that? I mean, in Washington, this went on when the U Street corridor and a lot of areas that once were considered unsafe, and people had bought houses there if they bought them instead of renting for $7,000 or $8,000. They were suddenly selling the houses for $800,000 and moving to Prince George's County, and that was a pretty easy deal. I don't think we necessarily have that easy deal, and it's compounded by homelessness. So where do these folks go? I mean, you saw this resistance.
A lot of them go out of state, which is something that we see with our businesses. It's unfortunate or fortunate, whichever way you look at it, but that's certainly where a lot of folks are going these days. They're getting paid a lot to move, and they are moving. Okay,
so let me follow that up with more than 2/3 of LA voters passed a major bond initiative to build housing for the homeless. The first proposal was to build a 49-unit shelter in Boyle Heights. It was blocked by a city council committee after the local council member opposed it and local residents protested. So if it's going to happen in community after community after community, how are we ever going to get past this? Except maybe the Governor Brown solution.
We see this a lot, and I think, if you think that's bad, I go to these hearings all the time, and it's really difficult to see a potential project where you have people begging for affordable housing, and then you have a project that is fully funded and ready to go, and it just needs the administrative approvals, the stamp of approval by the city, and they get told no because the people of the community say that they want to house the homeless, and they say that everyone deserves a chance and everyone should have a roof over their head. But if you want to put it down the street for them, oh, well, I'm all for affordable housing, just not next to me. I actually saw a 300-unit project once in another county, but close by here, that was 100% affordable for veterans. People who had come back from war, missing limbs, they were out on the street, post-traumatic. It was difficult because that hearing did not go as we had planned. Person after person after person got up and said, I love my veterans. I love this country. I support our veterans, but we just don't want that here. So it kind of gets back to what was said earlier. We all have to work together to say, all right, how are we going to solve this? We're going to preserve the single-family homes over here in Sherman Oaks, and over here, and over here, and over here, and we're going to say yes to the density. We're going to say yes to affordable housing projects. It really is on everyone's shoulders, and I will encourage everyone here to get involved politically in this sort of thing. There are so many hearings that happen in the city for projects, and we get so many people coming out against them. But it really takes a lot for people to come out for them because, you hope that it passes, but you don't really have a stake in it. Well, we do have a stake in it because there are people on the streets and there are people who can't afford to live here who need our advocacy. And when a council sees a whole lot of people saying no and no one's saying yes, this is why we're in this mess that we are today. We need to start saying yes in my backyard.
Okay, if we're going to talk about politics, there's one person on the panel who knows more about politics than all the rest of us put together. That's our moderator. Okay, so can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay. What is the role of an elected official? Is it, number one, to protect the interest of the constituents, or number two, to foist your views on the constituency?
Well, unfortunately, from your perspective, I suspect, I would answer with the words of Edmund Burke, who, in his famous speech to the electors of Bristol, said, "What I owe you most of all is my conscience." And if you've got a huge homeless problem, if you've got a lot of people who can't afford to live in a decent house, I think the proper role of an elected official would be to do something like what John has talked about, which is come to the table and try to create this grand bargain, not just to defend their own local constituency. That said, what do I think most local officials will do? They'll defend their own local constituency because they worry about re-election. And they're not as willing, say, as Edmund Burke would have been, to just walk away from his seat in Parliament. But I do not believe that people are elected simply to enact literally the will of their constituents. They're elected to offer their judgment, to understand the issues, and then to do what they think is right. How often does that happen? Sometimes. Listen, I don't want to monopolize this thing, and I just answered a question, which I've never done at one of these sessions. So why don't we open this up to the audience? Okay, there are a couple other questions, a whole bunch, all over there.
Are you going to ask me?
Microphone's coming.
Great.
Good evening. My name is Richard Iviles. I'm a dual degree in social work and urban planning. And my question, so in social work, we have something called the grand challenges. And they are the sort of the challenges of society that we should all work towards. And one of them being ending homelessness. Right now, my work is on sort of pitching this idea that gentrification should be the 13th grand challenge. And I grew up in this neighborhood and have seen how development has affected this neighborhood through the university and a lot of different things. My question is towards what is the conversation that social workers should be having? Because a lot of the times, there's a mention that the community would say, yes, we're down for the cause, but not in my neighborhood. I think a lot of the times as social workers, our power is in empowering. And when you can empower, you can shift power. So what would it look like if a social worker was there who understands human behavior and would be able to create programming for cohabilitation to happen, where we can live alongside our veterans or the homeless and change the rhetoric behind that? So my question is, what has been your experience with social workers involved in these type of projects, and what do you think we could do better?
Well, I don't have any direct experience per se, but to my point about the grand bargain, the other thing I'd say about it is that we would not want to pick single issues. And so in my mind, you can't separate housing from transportation. You can't separate that from, if you're going to strive to increase density, from parks and open space and healthcare and jobs and wages and everything. So the grand bargain here is not just about trying to bring every single constituency to the table, but to have them think about solutions in holistic ways. And until we can create a culture and an environment where that happens, I think all of these issues are really difficult to move forward, including how to solve the homeless crisis. Just securing the funds to do so is 1% of the solution. The next 20 or 30% is how you get a location in which it's possible to do it. But housing by itself is not the whole solution either. There are many, many other things that would have to happen in order for these solutions to be sustainable and meaningful in the long term for the individuals we're talking about.
Miguel Contreras, you spend a lot of time on this. Do you have any question or reaction to any of this?
Hi. Yeah, we deal a lot with, we're in the podcast, we're dealing less with the policy stuff, and we're on the ground talking to these people that have to move to, halfway to Mexico because they can't afford to live in Highland Park anymore. Communities where they spend all their lives. The thing that I'm still grappling with, trying to understand, is what's going to happen when everyone starts moving out and you have sort of this sort of race, I say like a race to the bottom, where people that have lived in these communities their whole lives just can't. So a couple of people have said, I can't afford to die in LA anymore. What kind of city is LA going to be? And that's sort of our big question that we're trying to get at. I don't know what your opinion is of that.
John, you can tell us what happened on every block in terms of crime over the last 10 or 15 years. What kind of city is LA going to be if we don't solve this?
I think if we don't solve it, it's a divided city with haves and have-nots. So gentrification cast a different way with a different set of participants and outcomes. One could argue was the American dream. So long as neighbourhoods are building social capital and building better housing stock and better facilities and parks and so forth, then you have the opportunity to improve life, and in the event that as people get older they want to move, they would have the opportunity to move out under their own terms. The gentrification that most people think about, if you take Highland Park as an example, the assumption is that the developers see a proximity to the city, see an old and to some extent tired housing stock that can either be refurbished or replaced, and that you would push the existing population out and a new population would come. Right? So that's often the narrative, and that's often in many situations what happens, but there ought to be other ways to think about how to build neighbourhoods and how to build wealth within neighbourhoods so that people could come and go under their own terms. But it's not then just about housing, it's about wages, it's about a livable wage, it's about schools and how good they are, and whether schools provide an opportunity for children to have maybe better opportunities in life than their parents did, etc., etc. So my point is simply that all of these things have to be thought of in one sense to be able to think of creative solutions that would move the whole discussion forward.
I'd also like to add, there is no easy answer to this at all. You can look at any city across the country, really across the world, and you will see that gentrification and people being displaced is unfortunately a way of life that as time goes on, it happens. Now, there are ways that we can mitigate it. That being said, I think a great place to start is creating a place for those people who are displaced to go. If we had an adequate supply that could actually serve those people who are displaced from those communities, they would be able to move in. But the problem is that we don't have vacancy. LA has consistently a below 3%, has had a below 3% or 3% or below vacancy rate in the city for the past several years. And that just means that low-income people cannot be competitive. Now, that being said, when there are laws that govern this that say that if you are a person in Highland Park, for example, now if you own a place, as it was said earlier, that you bought in the 60s for $7,000, now in Highland Park, you're selling it for, I don't know, under $1 million or over $1 million. You're doing pretty well. You can, decide where you want to go and live now. But if you're renting, well, then you are displaced and you are certainly at risk of either becoming homeless or living in further cramped quarters, moving out to San Bernardino, a place where the rents are more affordable because we don't have that volume to house those people. But those people do, and it's a little known fact, people do have a relocation fee that you are paid to just get you on your feet. And this was figured out some time ago. If I'm coming to you and I'm saying, all right, I know you've been renting for several years, but now I would like to sell this to someone who's going to convert it into new buildings, which, by the way, is also important so that you don't have blight and crime. That person who's purchasing or who has the property has to pay that person. And we're talking up to $30,000 to relocate. So now you've got anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000, which is all public information, by the way. You can look to see how much people get when they're relocated. $10,000 to $30,000 in your pocket. Go and help yourself get on your feet. So there are some support systems, but if we only had places to put these people, we wouldn't have this issue of gentrification with people being pushed out.
Sudha, anything on this? What do you think LA will look like in 20 years?
Well, I think this problem is going to be something that continues for the next 20 years. It's been a problem for the last 20 years, quite frankly. I mean, it's something that the market dynamics are going to work themselves out. There will be some combination, I think, of solutions that address the housing issue, and there'll be some combination of residents moving either out of LA, whether it's still in California or out of the state, and hopefully there's better transit options for folks in this town that will allow us to continue to evolve. But I think that's what ultimately happened. Nothing's going to happen quickly.
We have time for a couple more questions. People over there.
Hi, I'm Jake. I have a question about something that we haven't really talked that much about, which is sustainable housing and how sustainable housing can factor into this. So I recently read about a new development, I think it's going up in Koreatown, where they're going to be using storage containers as the apartments. So apartments somewhere around 200-300 square feet, which means it's a lot less expensive to heat and to cool these apartments. And then another thing that isn't really in LA, but we see in cities like Portland, in San Francisco, and Seattle, is the tiny house movement, which is a way that people are really trying to reduce their footprint. So I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on how this could, help with affordable housing, because in the long term, it's going to cost a lot less for residents to have, eco-friendlier spaces, and also for people to live in smaller spaces in general.
Are you a registered voter?
Yeah.
In LA?
Yes.
Do you know who your councilman is?
Yes.
Pick up the phone tomorrow, call your councilman, and say, I want tiny houses permitted. I want accessory dwelling units permitted, which, by the way, has just been sitting in limbo since February. The city has still not passed an ordinance for that. I want storage containers. I want this and this and this and this. If we all picked up the phone and told our elected officials what we want, they would respond. Unfortunately, a lot of the voices are very loud, but very few.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background. I actually interned at City Hall for a city council member last fall, so I do have some experience in this field, but I see that it's not just about the few people that step up and want these things, but it's about the stronger and more influential economic voices that don't want these things. So it's just, yeah.
Okay, by the way, I couldn't live in a tiny house, but I just wouldn't make it. Another question? Last question.
Can I just answer his question really
Sure.
quickly, though? Because I feel like you didn't get an answer. I said this earlier, if you sweeten the deal, if you make it feasible, and if you make it attractive, you will get what you're looking for. That's just economics.
One more question?
Hi, my name is Hannah, and my question is kind of, so we talked a lot about the housing crisis and homelessness, but not as much about transportation, and clearly that's a really big problem. Traffic, I think, is only getting worse as more and more people move to LA. So how would having better transportation kind of change the conversation about where we build housing and how we do it, or would it change it at all?
Let me try to answer that question. I think the problem that people perceive of sprawl, the perception of sprawl is bad, probably because there is not good public transportation. Everyone tries to get on the few freeways that we have. So once we do have, because we talked, what's going to happen in 20 years? Well, I think in 20 years, with the measure M passing, there's going to be a tremendous increase in the amount of rapid transit. So you can live in the suburban areas and get to your job quickly without sitting on the freeway going 5-10 miles an hour. So I think that's going to change the face, as they would say, of the city of LA and LA County for the good. And I think it will make it much easier to get housing because the land costs, which are a major portion of building affordable housing, will be much less expensive out in the so-called suburbs.
But where we need to be, probably in that context, is somewhere like the Netherlands. The Netherlands as a country has about the same land area as the LA metro area if we start in Ventura and go to Redlands, and if we start in Santa Clarita and go to San Juan Capistrano. Roughly the same population, roughly the same land area. We have little less than 100 train stations. Even on our busiest line, maybe in rush hour, the train goes every 5 minutes. In the Netherlands, they have 500 or 600 train stations. Last year when I visited, there was a brand new train station in Delft. The second part of the development was a 3-story parking garage for bicycles. Taxis and cars could still not get within 1 block of the station because that was priority 3. Right? And so when you're in the Netherlands, I've never rented a car. I have rented and bought a used bicycle. And much of the ways in which you'd ride a bicycle are not on the same road as cars going 40 miles an hour or 10 miles an hour or whatever. And so my point is that if you really want a different community that produces different outcomes, we need a complete rethink of which housing is just one necessary but not sufficient part.
There's one major reason that the whole state of California, but of course LA, exclusively for this discussion, does not have good transportation, and that is surprisingly because we have a law called the California Environmental Quality Act. It's called CEQA, the acronym, which allows people to use it as a tool to just fight what they don't want, again, in their backyard. So we saw this with the bullet train from San Francisco to LA. People said, I don't want that train here. So you've got a whole lot of people in LA who think, hey, it would be a great idea if instead of expanding the 405, if we just cut out the 2 lanes in the middle and put a train through. I mean, wouldn't that be great? Yeah, but try getting past CEQA. It's impossible. So until we get some reform at the state level on CEQA that says, look, there's no reason for you to do an environmental review and be able to bring lawsuits which drag out and bankrupt a company trying to build a project. There's no reason that that needs to be happening in an urban center. As soon as we get that reform, I think we would start to be able to see the kind of transportation that LA needs.
I think we have to come to a close. And by the way, we could have an entire evening on CEQA and the politics of CEQA. I want to thank Richard Close, Christine Rangel, John Wilson, and Sudha Reddy. And I want to thank the folks from ProCon because, as I said, this has been a wonderful experience for us. I hope it's been a good experience for them. We'll see you all back here next week. to begin to talk about the great divides. Thanks very much.